Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Katie Mishler, and I am a tutor and instructor in the UCD Writing Center. Today's workshop will be on reading journal articles. So to begin with, I want you to consider what is an academic journal article. Academic journals tend to publish innovative and contemporary research. So they're publishing research that has recently been completed and that is relevant to the current state of the art. Academic journals are also often peer-reviewed. You may oftentimes hear your lecturers or your tutors emphasize the importance of using peer-reviewed resources. The reason for this is when something is peer-reviewed, it means that it has, before it's been published, it's gone through a process in which experts in the field, who are the researchers' peers essentially, review the material to make sure that it is making a strong scholarly contribution, that it is engaging with the best techniques and the best research in the field. So that making sure it is not only of sound logic and methodology, but also that it is making an important contribution. Following with this, researchers publish articles in order to share their findings with the wider scholarly community. So they want to publish what they're working on so that other researchers can engage with and use and cite their research. Furthermore, by citing and referencing the works of their peers in articles, academics are also able to contribute to the exchange of ideas. So if an academic publishes a journal article and cites or references a colleague or another person working in the field, they're showing how their research builds on or is aligned with someone else's research. It's important for you to make sure that you are using scholarly resources. And there are a few ways that you can make sure that you are using these resources. The first one is to think about the research methods you're using to find it. So are you using a reputable scholarly database such as Google Scholar, UCD OneSearch, something like JSTOR? These are all databases which mine for scholarly articles from scholarly peer-reviewed journals. They're different than something like Google. If I put in a search term in Google, I might get a blog, I might get a newspaper article, I might get a resource that is not considered scholarly. So it's important for you to use scholarly databases. Another thing to think about is the details of the author. So think about who wrote it. What is their professional or academic standing? Do they have a PhD? Are they an expert in this field? What authority do they have to be writing about and publishing on this specific subject? The other thing to think about is the publication details. So think about who is the publisher. Is it a reputable scholarly publisher like an academic press such as Oxford University Press? Or is it perhaps a publishing house that publishes self-published works? You might also want to think about the date of the publication, particularly if you're working in the sciences. Sometimes you might use research that is from a few decades ago because it is still relevant because it has made such a strong contribution to the field. Maybe it's a foundational text or foundational experiment that you need to mention. But for the most part, you want to be demonstrating that you are engaging with current research. And finally, when identifying scholarly resources, you want to ask whether or not the resource is peer-reviewed. So for our first exercise, I want you to take a moment to practice identifying scholarly articles. So I want you to imagine that you are writing an essay for a nursing course on preventing falls in elderly patients. I want you to take a moment to review the beginning of this article and determine whether or not this research is an example of a scholarly article and why or why not. So you may want to take a moment to pause this because I will have the solution on the next screen. So here's the solution to the exercise. So this essay is an example of a scholarly article. The reason it is because it is published in a scholarly, peer-reviewed, reputable journal, which is, if you can see at the bottom of the extract, it says JAMA, or Journal for the American Medical Association, Internal Medicine. So you know that this is a well-respected, scholarly, reputable source. Also, if you look at the details of the authors, you can see they're all medical doctors or masters in public health, or they are PhDs, or there's one person who has a doctorate in pharmacology. So these people do have the credentials to be considered experts in their field. So another way to help you identify sources is to read the references. So if you have found a journal article that you find to be particularly helpful, it can be useful for you to look at who they are citing. So in doing so, you might want to think about whether there are titles for specific articles, or if there are specific academics whose works are repeated throughout the essay. Because if this person finds them helpful, you may want to look up those articles and engage with them as well, because you may find them helpful. Another thing is to think about if there are any titles of any articles that you think are particularly suggestive. So if you find a title and it seems to be aligned with your research, it's definitely a good idea for you to go and look it up. And in that, to determine if any of these citations are aligned with your research question. So for the second exercise, I want you to practice reading the references. So on the next slide, I will have a sample reference list from an essay on gender and modernism. So I want you to pretend that you are writing an essay on gender constructions in modernist writing. And I want you to look at the following reference list from an article which you have found particularly useful. And I want you to think about what other sources besides the article that you've just read may be useful for you to read, and why or why not. So please take a moment. I would pause the PowerPoint at this point. Take a minute, look over this, and try to think about which references would be helpful before I show you the solution on the next screen. So the solution to this is that there are quite a few articles that may be worth you looking up. It may be helpful for you to read works by the theorists who are cited multiple times, such as Kristeva, Spivak, and Wittig, as these writers are likely central to the theoretical argument put forward by the author. So if they're engaging with them and find it helpful, you might also find it helpful. These sources, along with others such as De Laurentiis and Marx, these are the sources which focus specifically on gender and modernism, could also be relevant. Additionally, depending on which modernist writer you're writing about, so if you're writing about Virginia Woolf, or if you're working on James Joyce, it may be helpful for you to look at those sources specific to each writer. Additionally, you may or may not have noticed this or not. This is a little bit of a trick question. You'll see here that a number of these sources are written in the 80s. There's one written in the 60s. There's also one written in the 50s. I'd say if you were writing this essay, you would want to go and look for more contemporary sources, if there are any, to make sure that you are engaging with the most innovative and recent work. However, for something like, we have a text here by Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. It was originally written in 1929. It was reprinted in 1957. That would be considered a foundational text. So even though it is at this point nearly 100 years old, it would be important for you to go back and look at that in spite of the date. So now that you've taken a moment to think about what constitutes a scholarly article and maybe some ways that you can use articles to find other scholarly articles, I want you to think about how you can approach these texts. So what you can do to determine whether or not they're relevant. So this is sort of a pre-reading step. This is what you want to think about before you start reading, because if you know why you are reading and what you're hoping to discover through reading, that can help guide how you read. So before you read, you should evaluate your research question or essay title closely and ask yourself, what information do I need to support my thesis? Why am I reading? What are my aims? What am I hoping to discover? For instance, if you're looking for very specific information to help support an argument, that may determine how you engage with text and what you focus on. Then if you are reading because there's an issue that you don't really understand and you're trying to learn more about it. So reading with purpose will always help strengthen what you get from your reading. So with this, it can be helpful for you to determine the relevance of text. So if you know why you're reading, you can help decide whether or not a text is relevant. So the first step is always to read the title. The title is the first thing that you encounter. So it is the first thing that introduces you to the topic of the essay. So always read that first and determine if it is relevant to your question. If it is, keep reading. If it's not, stop reading. The second step is to read the abstract. So an abstract is usually one paragraph that is at the beginning of an academic journal article, and it gives an overview to the main argument, to the main points, and to the main findings of an article. So it's basically a synopsis of the article. So it's a really good place to start when you're trying to determine if an article is relevant. So read the abstract, determine if it is relevant to your question. If it is, keep reading. If it's not, stop reading. The third step then is to read the introduction and skim the rest of the text. So the introduction gives you an overview of the essay, of its argument, of what points are made specifically to support that argument, and then also of how the article is structured. So this gives you an even more in-depth overview than the abstract of what is contained in the article. So if you read the introduction and again, skim over the rest of the text, if you think that this article is relevant, you should keep reading in depth. If it's not, you should stop reading. So this brings us to our third exercise, which is determining the relevance of texts. So I want you to imagine that you're writing an essay on international climate change policy. So looking first at the title, which is on this slide, and then at the abstract, which is on the following slide, I want you to take a minute to determine whether this article would be relevant to your research, and then to think about why it would be relevant or why it would not be relevant. So take a minute to first look at the article title. And now that you've looked at the title, take a minute to look at the abstract and try to think about whether or not this would be relevant to your essay question. So I would take a moment to pause this slide while you are reading the abstract. So the solution for this is open-ended. So whether or not you would find this article to be helpful would depend on how you are answering the question, which I purposely left quite broad, and which aspect of international climate change policy you will be focusing. So for instance, this article does mention global and local policies of potential organizational responses. So the word policies is in this abstract, and it is linked to the idea of climate change. If you were writing about international climate change policy and you were focusing on local grassroots efforts in, let's say, African and Asian countries, you might not find this helpful. However, if you were to be looking at, I guess, how policies are formed in relation to narratives of climate change, then there might be something in it for you. So whether or not this would be relevant to your research really depends on what type of questions you're asking about international climate change policy. So now that we've taken a moment to think about finding relevant sources, I want you to take a moment to reflect on how you read. A lot of times we talk about academic writing as a practice, but we don't talk nearly enough about academic reading as a practice. So I want you to take a minute and try to self-evaluate your reading and reflect upon how you read and try to think about whether you think you read efficiently and with purpose, or if you think that this is something you need to work on further. So one of the main focal points of this workshop is to try to give you an opportunity to learn to read more efficiently. So trying to reflect on reading as an academic practice. And there are certain things you can be doing to make sure you are reading efficiently and incorporating your reading into your writing in an efficient way as well. And one of those is to take these following steps. So learning how to scan, skim, and then gut the literature. And I'll walk you through how to do this. But using these 3 different techniques can help make your reading practice more efficient. So once you've determined if a text is relevant, once you've thought about why you are reading and how that can help guide your reading, you want to start scanning the text. So scanning means just looking for keywords. So for instance, if you were to take the earlier exercise on global climate change policy, you might want to scan for keywords such as global, climate change, and policy. So just go through an article and look to see if these keywords are featured in order to help and see if this article will be relevant to your studies. The next step is to skim. So skimming through the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion to determine the central thesis or problem. When you're skimming, you're not reading every word or every sentence, you're more reading for the general idea. So whereas you're scanning before to partially to determine the relevance of the text, but also to kind of get an idea, okay, this section looks like it might be more related to my research than this section. It gives you an understanding of the lay of the land with scanning. With skimming, you're going to step further and you are looking more for the actual big picture of the article. So trying to determine what is the central argument. With skimming, you also want to read headings and subheadings again to see how the information is organized. So there may be a particular section that you think is more relevant to a different section. However, you want to see how the sections all fit together. Another good idea is to read the first sentence of each paragraph or the opening of each section in order to, again, determine the author's argument. So if it is a well-written article, they should be introducing each section, each paragraph to give you an overview of what the main point of it is. So this can be a good way to read through the article and to get the main points without having to read every single word. So again, you are trying to read for meaning, but you're trying to be efficient in finding that meaning. And then the final step in this is to do what we call gutting the literature and to be ruthless in doing this. So you want to establish and evaluate the value of the article by looking at its aims, its introduction, its contents, and its index. And in doing so, you want to identify the passages that are most important to your aims. Once you've done so, you want to read the chosen sections in further depth. So what you're essentially doing is you've gone through, you've read the article for the main point so you can understand the overall argument that it is trying to make. But you're isolating the sections that you think are most relevant to your research, because these are the sections you really want to be paying attention to. sometimes students can come in and to the writing center and they can say that they feel really bogged down by their reading. And part of that is because they're going through and they're kind of taking notes on every single sentence. And in essence, they're rewriting the entire article, which is not an efficient way to read. So if you gut the literature, it does feel quite ruthless, but it helps you to be selective. So it lets you think, okay, this is the main point of the article, but this is the section that really relates to my argument, and this is where I need to be taking paraphrases from, or that I need to also be taking information from, or direct quotations from. So it lets you be selective in that. So for our fourth exercise, I want us to take a minute and to practice reading efficiently. So I want you to imagine that you are once again writing an essay on climate change, but this time you're focusing on its impact on agricultural policy. So I want you to think about how you would approach reading this article. So what specific steps would you take in reading the article? And in doing so, I want you to pay attention to how it is organized. So please take a minute. I would pause this slide, look at the article and the title at the bottom, and then to the right, look at the main headings, and just try to think about what approach you would take in reading it. And I will give you a solution on the next slide. So when it comes to reading efficiently, as it comes to any type of reading, I want you to always remember that how you are answering your essay title determines which parts of an article or which articles are most relevant to your research. So for this particular essay topic, it would be smart to focus on the section on policy implications. Although, and this is for the particular reason that it is the one that actually is aligned with climate change and agricultural policy. Okay, we know that explicitly. However, depending on other issues you may be looking at, depending on how you're interpreting the question, it would be a good idea for you to scan, skim, and gut the other sections for relevance. So in being efficient, it doesn't mean you're only looking at the section on policy. You still want to treat the entire article cohesively. All right, you don't want to get rid of everything else. But that's the section that I would think you would be focusing on while making sure you're scanning, skimming, and gutting the rest in order to make sure you understand the main point of the article and that you've also looked for other sections that might be relevant. So we've talked a bit about how to read efficiently. And one thing that really helps you with practicing efficient reading is to make sure that you are reading actively. So reading actively is obviously opposed to reading passively. When you're reading actively, you're engaging with the text as you're reading. You're thinking about it. You're thinking about the main points. You're processing the information. Whereas if you're reading passively, you're just reading without really beginning these steps of engagement. So active reading can be something as simple as highlighting the text, finding specific sections that you find particularly helpful and highlighting them. It could be annotating them, so making critical annotations or notes on them. It could mean asking critical questions, summarizing key points, or even rereading for comprehension. So not saying, I don't understand this section, I'll go back and read it later, but thinking, okay, I'm here now. I'm going to make sure that I read this section so that I understand it fully. And what this really means is that the more writing you do as you're reading, or the more annotation you do as you're reading, that means that you have something on the text. You have something from the text that you can easily incorporate into your writing. Because remember, you're reading to write. So the more writing you do early on, the better off you are. And with that in mind, that brings us to this idea of critical notation, critical annotation, and note-taking. So some things you might want to annotate are definitions. So you might want to look up and write down definitions of unfamiliar words. There might be concepts or theories that are important, interesting, or even sometimes difficult that you want to underline. With biases, you really want to be careful and look out if the writer has any biases or unstated assumptions. Also, you may want to see if you have any that are impacting the way you're reading. You want to write down any responses. So if there are any questions you have, any reactions or insights, you want to write that down. And finally, connections. So you want to make connections with other texts you have read, or even with the question that you're working on. And again, the more you actively engage with your reading, the easier it will be for you to incorporate it into your own work later. So this is actually a really important step. Okay, so I want you to take a minute to practice your critical annotation skills. So I want you to critically annotate the following extract from the New York Times. And I want you to practice your active reading skills while doing so. So I would get a piece of paper for this exercise if you don't already have one out already. And I've copied and pasted the introduction or an extract from the New York Times into the following slides. So what I would do is I would pause on each slide, read it, and take notes and annotations from it. The other thing is, I know that this is a workshop on reading journal articles, academic journal articles. The New York Times is a highly respected news source. However, it is not it's not an academic journal article. But for the purpose of this exercise, I want you to pretend that it is. All right? So take a minute, read through the extract, and try to come up with some sample annotations, pausing on each slide so you can read through the extract, and then moving on to the solution afterwards. Okay, so this is a sample solution. There is no right or wrong answer to this because, again, how we read, what we respond to, a lot of times has to do with how we're interpreting the information and why we're reading. So I just gave you some examples of some critical annotations that I made during this exercise. However, again, they're just samples. Yours could be different. Some of them might overlap. If they do, great. If they don't, that's completely fine. So one concept I underlined is a sentence which I saw as being the central argument of the piece. And for that reason, I thought it was important for me to make sure I underlined it. So this line reads, while many people say multitasking makes them more productive, research shows otherwise. Heavy multitaskers actually have more trouble focusing and shutting out irrelevant information, scientists say, and they experience more stress. So I saw these lines as being kind of the argumentative linchpin, so I wanted to make sure that I would underline it. I saw an example of bias or an unstated assumption, so I put a question mark beside it. It's the line that reads, his wife, Brenda, complains, it seems like he can no longer fully be in the moment. So I'm saying that Brenda Campbell assumes that her husband can't concentrate because of technology. However, I don't see any evidence that says this is necessarily true. So could there be another reason besides this anecdotal evidence? And with that, since we are treating this like a scholarly article, remember, we're pretending this is not popular journalism, I wrote the following question as a response, reading, where is the evidence to this quote from Nora Volkow, and it reads, "The technology is rewiring our brains." So again, this is a question where I wanted to return to this idea and critically engage with it in further depth, and maybe even argue with it, say in my essay, because I didn't see any evidence for this. So again, these are just some samples to show you how critical imitation can work. So with that, I want you to remember that with critical evaluation, you should always be asking questions as you read. You should always be engaging with what you're reading, and you should always make sure that you are questioning things and engaging with it. So the purpose of this is to make it easier when you incorporate this evidence into your own work. So we're changing gears here a little bit. So I wanted to take a minute before we talk about critical evaluation to talk about how critical evaluation applies to the sciences, because the sciences have their own specific forms of evidence, of forming a methodology, of forming an argument. So there are some specific questions we can ask when it comes to how we evaluate scientific articles. One thing can be to use this very helpful outline from Dr. Jennifer Raff on how she suggests individuals read scientific papers. So when it comes to evaluating scientific articles, the first thing you want to look at is the abstract. And you want to ask yourself whether it is intelligible and if it clearly describes the objectives and results obtained and the conclusions reached. So the abstract, as I mentioned before, should give a comprehensive overview of the article, of its main points, its main methodologies, its main argument, and its main findings. So you want to ask yourself if the abstract is including that information. The next thing you want to be doing is to look at the introduction. So you want to ask yourself if there is a clear reason established for doing this study. So with science in particular, you want to identify the gap in the field. So you want to demonstrate, okay, these researchers have done this work, however, this work, which is relevant, has not been done. So you want to make sure they're justifying why they're doing the study. You also want to see what research questions are asked. You want to see what are the article's main aims and objectives. And you also want to make sure that the author has reviewed relevant literature, including conflicting or alternative viewpoints. So one section that is pretty standard in scientific articles, which we don't see so much in the humanities, is the methodology section. So it's important for when you're evaluating an article, you want to make sure that standard methods are being used and adequate references are given for those methods. If any methods have been modified, you want to make sure that they are fully described so that if someone were to replicate the experiment, they would be able to do so. You want to make sure that they're justifying why they're using specific methods, particularly if they're using an unconventional methodology. You also want to see if there are any potential problems or limitations to the methods, and if they are, have they noted them? And finally, you want to make sure that the methods they're using are appropriate. So then you come to the concluding section to the scientific article, which is the conclusion. So you want to make sure that the way that the abstract describes the objectives and results is aligned with the conclusion. You also want to make sure the conclusion is well supported and that it follows logically from the rest of the paper. So after this section, I know we've taken a moment to focus just on scientific articles, but a lot of this is you thinking about the logic and the reasoning behind a specific article and why it is being done, and how it is being done. And you'll see there is quite an overlap between the evaluation of scientific articles and the evaluation of critical arguments that you might see in other fields. So with this, you always want to make sure that when you're incorporating sources and when you're reading sources, you're actively engaging with them, you're analyzing, you're thinking about them critically. And the following questions on evaluating critical arguments can help you accomplish this. So you want to make sure that the evidence is factual and objective. You want to ask, is the evidence subjective or is it objective? If it's subjective and anecdotal, that means it's probably weak evidence. You also want to ask, is the argument balanced? So does the author consider all potential viewpoints? And with that, you also want to think about whether or not there are any unstated biases or assumptions being made. You also want to think about whether or not the text uses terms loosely without fully considering their meanings or defining the terms they're using. For instance, a term like neoliberal. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot in journalism, in media, and you want to make sure that you are defining that term and showing how you're using it before you apply it to a specific a specific argument or specific situation. You also want to consider what counterarguments could you pose against the text and if the text adequately addresses these concerns. So are there any points or ideas that they're overlooking in the construction of their argument? You also want to check and see if the language is objective and factual or if it is overtly biased and subjective. You want to see if the information is precise and specific rather than overly vague and generalized. And you also want to think about how the text responds to the work of other critics or academics and whether or not it successfully incorporates other critical support. So for our final exercise, I want you to practice evaluating arguments. So I want you to return to the article from the New York Times, and I want you to ask yourself first, what is the author's main argument? Then I also want to take a minute and read back through the piece and evaluate the argument using the criteria stated in the previous slides. You may also find your critical annotations will help you in this exercise. So I'm going to do the same thing again where I'm going to go through each of the slides that have the extract on it. So I would take a second, pause each one before moving on to the next one. So the solution to this is, again, a sample solution. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but these are some of the ways I evaluated the arguments present in this specific essay. And again, we are pretending this is an academic essay. So first of all, I asked myself if the language is objective and factual or if it is biased and subjective. I found that it was biased and subjective. So it relies heavily on anecdotal evidence and the subjective experience of a tech entrepreneur, Cord Campbell. So this is fine for popular journalism, but for academic writing, we need objective, factual evidence to back up our points. I also asked myself, is the information precise and specific? And I found that the information presented is vague and non-specific. And for example, when it talks about scientific terms. So at one point, it describes a very complex neurobiological mechanism as a dopamine squirt. I don't think that is a scientifically accurate way of talking about neurobiology. So for that reason, I think this, again, is a very weak source, a very weak argument. So finally, I asked myself, How does the text respond to the work of other critics or academics? And does it successfully incorporate other critical support? So I answered, although the article alludes to the work of academics, it oftentimes refers to unspecified scientists, researchers, or new research. It does not cite or include the details of their sources. It also provides unsubstantiated evidence, such as in 2008, people consumed 3 times as much information each day as they did in 1960. So, in an academic essay, you would always need to cite things properly. In an academic journal article, it's the same thing. You would never want to just broadly say scientist. You'd want to say who the scientist was who's done this work. You also wouldn't want to make a blanket general claim that you couldn't back up. So for this reason, I think that this is quite a weak argument. If I were to engage with this in an essay, I would want to talk about why it's weak and how it's weak, rather than using it to support my actual points. I would actually say, though, if I were writing an academic essay, I wouldn't use this source. I think it would be too weak of a source. But it gives you an idea of how you can approach and analyze and engage with academic articles more generally. So in conclusion, we've gone over quite a bit when it comes to both sourcing academic articles, determining their relevance, trying to think about reading efficiently. We've also talked a bit about how to evaluate critical arguments, and we've also covered information on reading actively. I think the biggest takeaway from this is to make sure that you're reading with purpose, that you're reading mindfully, that you know why you're reading, because that can help you determine what it is you're looking for and how you can approach what you're reading. I would also say the other takeaway is to make sure that as you're reading, you're always writing, you're always engaging with things, and you're always annotating. This will make it easier for you to incorporate what you read into your texts. All right. I want to thank you guys so much for taking a moment to listen to this workshop. The Writing Center is still open 5 days a week. We are making appointments online and giving appointments online. So please contact us to make an appointment. Whether you have a question about what is in this specific workshop or any other question about your writing, we're here to help. Thanks again.